We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Johnston, and today we are joined by Dr. Miranda Giacomin. Miranda Giacomin is an associate professor in the psychology department at MacEwan University. She is a personality and social psychologist who examines how people's personality traits influence their first impressions. Well, hello, Miranda. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. I was hoping if we could start by getting you to tell us a little bit more about your research and what you're doing here at MacEwan.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm a social and personality psychologist, which basically means I research how our individual differences influences our social behavior. And so my research in particular, I study people's narcissistic tendencies. And so that is basically how grandiose they feel, how self-focused they are, how vain an individual might be. And I look at how those personality traits influence their interactions with others. So how well they get along with other people, what does that look like in their romantic relationships? And then I also look at how these personality traits might impact people's first impressions. So can we detect how narcissistic somebody is when we first meet them, and then by getting to know them later?
Interesting. So what inspired you to start researching this, like specifically the narcissism and all of that? Like what inspired that?
I originally started by looking at people's self-esteem, and then it turned into looking at more extreme forms of that. And narcissism is just a really interesting personality trait because individuals who are high in narcissism are often really well liked when you first meet them, right? They're charming, they're charismatic, they're fun to be around, they're exciting. And then later on, it becomes this more maladaptive trait where these individuals care less about others, care less about your feelings and what's going on around them. And so it can have like these detrimental effects on people's lives. And so it was interesting to sort of look at that dichotomy in the trait.
Yeah. Could you just I know narcissism is a term that most people know, but just for anybody who might know kind of the specifics, would you be able to define exactly what narcissism is and what that looks like?
Yeah, so what I'm talking about is sort of grandiose narcissism, which is an individual difference that people exhibit. And really what it's focusing on, if you're high in narcissism, you're often more self-focused. You can care less about other people's feelings. You can be lower in empathy. And you also have this exaggerated sense of self where you view yourself sort of overly positively.
Yeah. And okay, so what's the difference between that and like the grandiose? Like what would be the difference there?
It's all one. So grandiose narcissism is sort of one catch-all term for when you sort of think of narcissists in your head. This is what we're typically thinking of. If you delve deep into the narcissism literature, there's different types of narcissism. And so some narcissists have really high self-esteem, and then other types of narcissists, which are called vulnerable narcissists, have lower self-esteem and project their narcissism a little bit differently than our grandiose.
Okay, so you look at grandiose, so you look at narcissism kind of as a whole rather than like each like one little subcategory of it.
Yeah, so grandiose is sort of the big one subset of it, and then there's a whole other realm.
Okay.
Vulnerable narcissists out there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's dive a little bit more into the specifics then of your research, because you've already mentioned first impressions. So I wanted to start by asking, like, why are first impressions so important?
Yeah. So first impressions are pretty important for us in our lives and the image that we present to other people. And so we often use first impressions when we are dating, for example, or when we're hiring somebody, or even when we're making voting decisions. A lot of that is based on the impression that we get of somebody and deciding, whether or not they're going to be a good leader or a not so good leader. And so these impressions that we form can have really drastic impacts on our lives. And so it is always good, I think, to put your best foot forward and try and
Mhm.
make a positive first impression.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, going off of that, you co-wrote a paper titled "Misperceiving Grandiose Narcissism as Self-Esteem: Why Narcissists Are Well Liked at Zero Acquaintance." What What do you mean by zero acquaintance?
So zero acquaintance means you don't know somebody. You
Okay.
have zero previous experience with that person. So in that paper, we were essentially judging strangers and we were showing them, photographs of somebody you don't know and saying, hey, how narcissistic do you think this person is?
Huh. Okay. So zero acquaintance you don't know, but really just looking at somebody you kind of already form your first impression
So with
of
very minimal
them.
information about somebody,
Yeah.
we make a judgment about, how warm do they seem? How sociable do they seem? How dominant do they look? Do they look trustworthy?
Yeah.
And we had to do this within like a split second.
That's fair. And what were the findings of this study? Like, were people able to detect narcissists?
Yeah, so what research has generally found is that we can detect narcissism from very minimal information, even, a facial photograph. We're able to more accurately detect whether or not somebody is narcissistic. In that paper in particular, what we found was that we can kind of understand why someone might be narcissistic, but we don't necessarily use that information when making our first impressions. So, on one hand, knowing that someone's narcissistic would give you information that maybe they're not a great relationship partner, they're not going to be a good friend down the road. But we don't use that when we're forming our first impressions of someone. And in that paper, we found what we do is we sort of conflate it with self-esteem. And we really like people who are high in self-esteem. Like that's a very socially valued trait. And if someone's perceived to be high in self-esteem, then we perceive them to be more attractive and competent and, possess a host of good qualities. And so what we do for narcissists is we think, oh, they have high self-esteem, so we like that. And then we can maybe err in our judgments, right? We end up liking the narcissist maybe more than we should initially.
Yeah. Were there any specific markers that you found that people were picking up in these photos that led them to say, like, this person has high self-esteem?
So in that particular study, we didn't look at, what are the cues that
Okay.
people use.
Yeah.
In other research, though, I have looked at, what are some of these cues. So in one paper in particular, we found that just from a facial perspective, it was actually the eyebrows that were sort of the cue to people's narcissistic tendencies, which is weird.
Yeah, I would have never have thought
know.
eyebrows. Eyes maybe, but not eyebrows.
Yeah, the eyebrows are actually interesting just from a facial recognition perspective. So when someone's walking towards you, you actually don't notice the eyes as much as the eyebrows. Like they're there giving definition to your face. And so what we found is that people who are higher in narcissism actually have more distinct eyebrows. So you almost are able to better recognize them from a distance, which is sort of consistent with the trait. Now, I will caveat that in saying that this research was also done at a time where having darker, denser, more distinct eyebrows was like the trend, right? Filling in those eyebrows. And so it could just be that individuals higher in narcissism, are following the trends, right? Which also aligns with the trait itself. Other research has looked at, obviously when we look at a person, we're not just seeing their face. We're seeing, their hair, their clothing choices, their mannerisms, their voice. And so looking at somebody with more information, you can still obviously do a better job at detecting someone's narcissistic tendencies. So individuals higher in the trait usually have a neater, more organized appearance. They tend to wear more trendier, flashier clothing. More makeup, right, to like gain the attention that they're looking for.
Yeah, interesting. Because you're right. Like eyebrows definitely have gone through trend cycles, and so do clothing, so do hairstyles, and everything. So I guess it does kind of make sense that people who have high self-esteem, they put in that effort to like, be on trend, as people would say.
So it could be a cue, right? When we're making these judgments, that's all we can go off of is, what is the cue? And sometimes the cues that we're using are accurate, and then sometimes they're not predictive of the trait at all.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. You also have done a lot, like, well, kind of keeping on this like makeup, hair done, all that kind of trend. You've done some work like recently in leadership, specifically the difference between males and females, like men and women, in leadership roles. And I was wondering if you could kind of just explain a little bit more about that for us.
So, for example, let's just say I ask you, think of a leader, right? There's sort of a mental image that gets generated in your mind. What would that be for you? Not to put you on the spot.
Like, no word of a lie. The first thing that popped in was Obama, like previous president of the United States.
Yeah, so that's a good representation. Typically, we see like male, dominant, more assertive, confident, right? All those sort of pictures sort of pop into our mind, and that reflects what we call our schema of a leader, or prototype, or cognitive prototype of what a leader is. And so in some of my research, we looked at how our cognitive prototypes of what a leader is conflates with our gender stereotypes, because often, men are associated with more agentic traits like being confident, dominant, masculinity, maturity.
Yeah.
And then women are associated with more communal traits, so they're kinder, warmer, more trusting, helpful, and stuff like that. And so when we think of our stereotype of what a leader is and then what our stereotype of a male is, right, those two things overlap with one another.
Yeah.
Whereas it's inconsistent when you have the idea of a leader and it being a woman. And so we explored the cognitive prototypes that people have in their mind. And in that research, we basically found that, again, those two things overlap for men. So a male leader and a male non-leader are perceived as equally powerful. Whereas for women, a female leader is considered more powerful than just a female non-leader, essentially. So in order for women to become leaders, they have to appear more powerful almost to fit the role.
Interesting. And okay, so you kind of touched on that, like what the difference is between the two. Was there kind of a difference in like between? Yeah, I think you did touch on this, but a difference between women and their ideas and men and their ideas of what a leader is?
Surprisingly, there's not that big a difference in terms of the cognitive prototypes that we develop, because these are like pictures that have been reinforced over time by like seeing more male leaders, right? And so most people would generate an image in their mind of a leader being male and dominant and more agentic in nature. So there isn't really a difference between what women and men imagine in their minds. It's more so, how can we sort of change that prototype, right? And that's why we say representation is so important, because the more female leaders you see, maybe more feminine those images will become, I guess, is the hope. The prototypes or the schemas that we have.
Okay. And I guess for that to come into being, we'll need to see more women in power. Like, that's just kind of how things are going to change.
Yeah. It's all like cyclical, right? Like you see a female in power, you're like, okay, I can do that too, right? And then that might like change your trajectory.
Yeah. And yeah, like I know things are changing. Like we do see more and more women in power, but I do also still see it being harder, like still harder for women to be in positions of power and in leadership roles.
And what we find is like women tend to face like a double barrier. So not only you have to live up to your gender stereotype, so you're not confusing people, right? So you still have to be warm and kind and trusting. And then on top of that, you also have to be powerful and have those leadership qualities. And so women are facing it double, right, in order to end up in these leadership positions. And of course, there's a host of other things that influence that, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Like all of this stuff is so interesting. Kind of coming back to MacEwan, with your research, um, MacEwan's known for having undergraduate students participate in research. And I was just curious, how do you utilize students within what you're doing here?
Yeah, so I love incorporating and having students participate in my research and get involved. So every year, you have multiple research assistants and honors thesis students and independent study students who all contribute to my program of research. And they get involved in a host of ways. Like sometimes that's idea generation. A student will show up and be like, I had a thought. And it's like, okay, how can we turn this into a research project? And then it's like, how do we build the procedures that we want to use? How do we apply for ethics? How do we, get data? And so they're involved from beginning to end. How do we analyze the data? And so it's a lot of fun, including students.
Yeah. Do you have a lot of students like jumping at the opportunity to kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of students who are interested. And I think the trait of narcissism is just like naturally appealing to students. So yeah, there's always lots of students eager to get involved.
Right.
And we're so fortunate at MacEwan that our student body is so engaged and curious.
Yeah. No, that's really nice to hear that people are like excited. And you're right, narcissism is a really interesting
Hot topic.
to study. Like so yeah. Why I know I asked why narcissism originally, but I want to know what makes this work that you're doing meaningful to you.
One, I think I'm interested in, how do you put your best foot forward? How do you form, a positive first impression? Because that impression, essentially what happens is whatever people think about you initially, it sort of escalates, right?
Yeah.
We use like our confirmation bias. And if I have good thoughts about you, then like I pick up on all the good things afterwards.
Yeah.
But if I form a negative impression of someone initially, then you start to pick up on all the negative things moving forward. And so our first impressions can be pretty long lasting. And so I've taught a course here before on, how to form a good impression. It was like, okay, how can we work on these impressions and use the research to guide that? So I think that's important. And then I think making good social decisions are also important, right? Like figuring out who you want to date, who you want to marry, who are good friends and people to keep in your life, versus maybe people who are more harmful to you and you might want to exclude from your life. And so all of that is important to try and figure out. I don't have a full answer, which is why we keep doing research and exploring it.
Oh, amazing. That did remind me of a question that I wanted to ask, and I'm not sure how I want to phrase it. But before, when we were talking about how people could pick up on personality traits through pictures and through just like zero acquaintance, first impression, not knowing them, you had said that people were able to pick up on it, but that then they didn't really do anything with that information. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. Like, why don't we do anything with that information, even though we can be like, okay, yes, we can see that this person might have these traits?
Yeah, I think, maybe we just see people more positively, right? So we might notice it. And they're like, it's not that bad. Maybe we dismiss it. Or we turn it into something different, right? So in terms of narcissism, we turn it into self-esteem, which we like. And so we're like, yeah, we can keep talking. Or if you're trying to figure out who to date or you're scrolling on Tinder or Bumble or whatever, right? Yeah, it's fine that they seem to take a lot of pictures of themselves because that might reflect, okay, they're confident and I like that. So we just don't use it. In that paper that we talked about, actually, there was one experiment where I actually told people, like, this person is high in narcissism. And then people didn't like them as much.
Oh, okay. So knowing that, like, yes, this person does have these narcissistic traits.
It was a deterrent.
Yeah, that biased people against what they would have seen in them had they not known that.
Yeah, so if we confirmed their suspicion for them, then people were like, no, I don't like them as much anymore. Now, that could be just social desirability, right? So if we think narcissism is a bad trait, then we're going to say, oh, no, I don't like it anymore. Whereas if they weren't told that, then they were like, yeah, I like this person.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess, yeah, like you had said, narcissism traits are usually things that we look for in people. Like they have high self-esteem, they're confident,
Yeah.
they're all of this. But the term narcissist and narcissism, like obviously it is like a mental... Am I correct in saying that it's a mental disorder? Is that not? Because I remember taking psychology classes.
Yeah, so it can. Some people can have narcissistic personality disorder.
Okay.
The way I study it, though, is
Yeah.
looking at it as a personality trait. So
okay. So just a trait,
you can
not
measure
a...
it in anybody, and some
Yeah.
people are going to be higher, and some people are going to be lower, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a disorder
Okay.
at all. You're just
But I think a lot
have
of
more of that
people
trait.
conflate the term narcissism with the
disorder,
disorder. So a lot of people, when they hear narcissistic or narcissism, it has like derogatory, or not derogatory, but it definitely has like bad connotations. They're like, we don't
Yeah.
like this.
Yeah. Except, actually, interesting fact, people who are higher in narcissism will actually report liking that trait more. And so for the narcissist, being narcissistic is a good thing because that's sort of what helps them get ahead, right? We're like, of course I love myself. This is how I get to where I am.
Well, and I guess, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
so
your fun fact.
Yeah. No, this whole topic is so fascinating because it is really interesting to hear about how we work and how our brains work, and all these different like personality traits, because you know we're all so different. We all have different traits, and learning why people act the way that they do, I think, is fascinating.
Yeah.
So given all of this, I kind of want to end it by asking, how do you see your research impacting like people's everyday lives in the future?
I mean, I hope it is somewhat informative to them to understand, how do we form first impressions? What should we be looking for? What qualities should we care about versus not care about? Ultimately, I feel like sometimes our research can be sort of, it's at the scientific level, right? And it sounds really complicated. So I always think of my research as it's never going to impact people as much as like the students who have helped and contributed to it, right? Because it's the students that you work with and that you help train and develop and, hopefully inspire. And then they go off and, get wonderful careers and become clinicians and counselors and, occupational therapists and whatever else they're out there doing. And like they're impacting people daily. And so I feel like it's the students who help people more than the research that we actually built.
But that's actually like so like nice to hear, and like that's such a great way of looking at it. Like I do the research so I can help people go out and help people.
Yeah.
No, I think that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, it has been. Thank you. Well, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit Research Recasted on your favorite podcast platform to find new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can leave us a like, give us a follow, or send us any follow-up questions you have from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization Podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.